Um, we begin with a presentation from Nigel on the 25-26 budget presentation. Following that, we will break into our individual committees, and instructions on that will be part of Nigel's presentation. So in order that we hit the 7:30 start, I will pass over to Nigel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Great to see so many people here this evening. Maybe one for you, Ben. Maybe I can start selling tickets for this. Get part of the commercial program. So I'm pretty sure it's more me that you're coming to see than the content, because the content of these things is not normally that positive. And for those of you that have been very close to the November government finance policy last week, a lot of change. But I'm going to try and refrain from using the word uncertain as much this year as I did last year, even though there is still a huge amount of uncertainty in the medium term. So I'm going to run through a broad range of areas, but in terms of the overall budget for 25-26, the headline is there's no significant change in our approach to balancing our budget or our overall strategic ambitions and aims. And in terms of the budget overall, there's a real drive for that commercial and income generation to help us fund the services that we really want to deliver and our residents really want us to deliver to them in the standards that we have done historically and the high standards that we want to maintain going forward. In terms of over the presentation, we'll cover 6 key areas. First of all, I give a very high level local government funding position of what we know now. We have still got the local government finance settlement coming on the 19th of December, and there is probably more uncertainty on what we're going to get funding-wise between November and December this year than any other year. We'll go through some of the reasons for that. And then we'll go through the budget and MTFS assumptions with no significant changes, and we'll run through pressures, risks, inflation, and then a little bit of a summary on council tax and business rates, just to keep members well informed of the continuing policies that we have in place. And then a very high level look, a couple of slides on the HRA, although there is a much more detailed presentation being provided at the Housing and Community Overview and Scrutiny this evening. So there'll be a lot more chance in terms of scrutiny for that. So where do we stand at the moment? We had the local government settlement. We had the local government review that took place as part of the wider government settlement in October the 30th, which released government spending figures and gave us a kind of headline position of where we're at, followed by November's policy statement on late Thursday last week, early Friday, for those very keen members, and I'll give a synopsis of where we're at. But I think it's a good place to start is to look at something we picked up at the MTFS, but around the wider economic impact and the reason why the government is doing what it's doing and what the impact is on us. So as a country at the moment, we have very low levels of growth. The government is funded through the tax that it collects. If growth is low, then growth in the tax base is low as well. So from that perspective, the government has less money to allocate out to different services. As most people in this room will be aware, there are significant shortages in funding in things like health and social care and other aspects of government policy that are highlighted and ranked slightly higher than local government. I'm sure if the people in this room were to rank the importance of the services provided by central government, local government would probably come significantly higher. Unfortunately, we don't have that joy at this moment in time. So this has, to a certain extent, given the present government and the historical government, very difficult decisions to make in terms of where they allocate their funding. So what has that meant for local government in terms of announcements and headlines and where we're at the moment? So there will be a local government fair funding review in the spring of 2025. Long awaited, 6 years we've been waiting for what is now being reclassified as a fair funding review after a couple of years of a different name. That will come out and that will provide certainty going forward with multi-year settlements from 26/7 onwards. So there's a real positive in terms of where we're going to go in the medium term. The issue we have at the moment is that it is going to include some of the biggest changes in local government finance we've seen in the last decade. They are talking about changing what they're doing with business rates, but a massive business rate reset, which means reassessing how much business rates goes to different authorities across the country and the mechanism for that. They're looking at consolidating all the grants that exist at the moment into a much more simplified, transparent process. And they're looking to change a lot of the fundamental grants that we receive at the moment. This has already led to some impacts. So in terms of 25-26, they've already removed the Rural Services Grant and the Services Grant as of last Friday. Shock to the sector, but again, step in the right direction from the government's perspective in terms of simplifying how things are. Equally, New Homes Bonus and Minimum Funding Guarantee, the only two core grants that we get from government, will not exist after 25-26. So that's a significant change. And again, what will be the future, we will hopefully find out in the spring. In terms of broader areas, in terms of government funding announcements on business rates, as I've mentioned, they have said they're going to reset it. There'll be a whole 12-month process starting off in January around how that will work and what impact that will have on different authorities. That has always been put in the too difficult to do box. So again, significant reform, significant changes that will impact the quorum, local authorities as a whole, and potentially businesses depending on the direction. In terms of short-term impact, in 25-26, they have reduced the retail, leisure and hospitality relief from 70% to 40%. For those members that have been around a few years, the retail, leisure and hospitality relief came about as of COVID, as they were sectors that were hit most, and started off at 100%. This will mean that those sectors will have increasing bills next year. On the back of the fact that they're already increasing in terms of the amount that they have to pay initially before relief, that will be a big impact for a lot of businesses and ones that they will feel pressure. It doesn't directly hit us, it indirectly hits us by the amount of business rates that we collect. In terms of council tax, they have made it very clear that there's going to be no changes to the referendum threshold for next year, although we do have the settlement in 2 weeks, and at the moment, with all the changes that happen, it wouldn't be the biggest shock in the world if they changed their mind in that period of time. One really big positive, which members in this room may be aware of, and I know Chris Baker, the head of Revs and Bens, is absolutely delighted. Every year, several hundred residents get very confused by the council tax bill with the 3% for Herts County Council and 2% precept, and the numbers not actually adding up on the bill because they're calculated differently and it was set by statute. The government, maybe to give some positivity to local authorities, have decided to simplify the council tax bill. So it should be easier with one line for Herts County Council, and so easier for residents to understand what increases have come about. But we do watch this space in terms of details on that. In terms of the actual finances, so as announced in October and reiterated again last week, local government funding has increased by 3.2% in real terms or 5.6% in cash terms. But that is not the case for decorum. In terms of decorum, the areas of growth that make up that are around social care and areas of deprivation. We do not hit most of the significant levels of deprivation on a nationwide scale. We do have pockets of deprivation, but we don't have wholesale deprivation like some areas, and we don't deliver social care services. So from our perspective, they're not going to come to decorum. So what does that mean? That means when you actually look at our funding levels from central government, we will be receiving a 0% increase in cash terms. So a real terms decrease when you allow for inflation. That is significant because it is our major funding stream and it's not going up. And as we all know in this room, be it through the council or through our bills that we pay, costs go up year on year, particularly in recent years. So we can't even stand still with the funding we're getting from government. We have to make savings or we have to increase income generation to balance the books. And again, that's not an insignificant job for us to do. The good news, if you want, is that we expected a settlement like this. So in our budget pack this evening and in our medium-term financial strategy, we were projecting for funding to be along the lines of what they have outlined in the last week. We still need to get the final figures, but from our perspective, we feel that we should be in line or maybe even slightly better, depending on what the government do with their numbers on the final settlement in 2 weeks' time, which means we don't have to start looking to find savings for next year. And I know there are several authorities, potentially some in Hertfordshire, that are now at this late stage having to reopen their budgets. So good financial planning and good projecting has put us in a reasonably strong position in regards to that. Just to dissect that a little bit more, And I've made this graph a little bit simpler than what I've presented in previous years. And I've added New Homes Bonus into government grants as a whole to make it a little bit more straightforward. As you can see there, our funding year on year has gone down. So again, instantly we can't keep doing what we do. There are funds that have gone to other areas of local authority. So Herts County Council will see an increase of significantly greater than 5.6%, but Shire and district councils will see a lower level. As you can see from that graph, we are getting to a point now where our government funding is getting to a point where it may not exist in future years. And that is a potential risk going forward in terms of our financial planning. But again, we will find out more as part of the settlement on the 19th of December and even more in the spring of the Fair Funding Review. What does that mean for us if our core funding from government isn't increasing? Well, the other aspect we have to our funding is council tax. As a council, we have predominantly maxed out our council tax increase year on year. And what this graph shows is the council tax growth every year in comparison to the inflationary pressures that we are facing as a council. So in summary today, government funding flat at best. Council tax increased by the maximum amount we can do for government and what they expect us to do. Inflation increasing by a greater amount. That is what is creating a budget deficit year on year. Less funding, more cost. So in terms of the council, how do we approach that? We've taken two clear strategies in recent years to do that. First of all, we've looked at reducing the cost of delivering our services and delivering efficiencies year on year. On average, the council has delivered £400,000 a year of cashable savings over the last 4 years. Over that same period of time, we've delivered £1.4 million of non-cashable efficiencies. One of those large ones was the waste service. By non-cashable efficiency, I mean we brought the cost of the service down closer to the budget than the overspends that were previously experienced. So there's a lot of work that has been done on efficiencies and on reducing the cost that we do. But that isn't enough to fill this gap. The second aspect that we've been working on significantly and continue to do so going forward is looking at our commercial strategy. And in terms of the commercial strategy, this big yellow part of the pie chart is fees and charges. And that is an area where we can look at delivering these services more efficiently or in driving our income generation to improve the service or to maximise the assets that are delivering those services. And those two key strategies over the last few years is what have helped us balance that gap from 22-23 onwards between the blue and the orange lines. And in summary, just to summarise that in totality, this is what we have done between 21 and 24-25. The blue one is the inflation and the service pressures that we've had, so some growth in some areas. The orange bar is the increase in council tax predominantly, with some slight increases in funding at different points during that period. The grey one is the efficiencies that I've mentioned and the income generation that we've also created over the last few years. We have increased fees. We've done that because we're delivering high quality services that require the investment to continue to deliver those. So fees have gone up and are proposed to go up in 25-26 in garages predominantly, but also small changes with garden waste as well. We've already had lots of discussions over the parking that's been implemented this year and for future years, which forms part of that as well. Without increasing that income generation, we wouldn't have been able to balance our books without potentially far more difficult discussions around what services we deliver and how we deliver them. It is not getting any easier. From 26-27, we will no doubt be asking the same questions about the same discretionary services and whether we can still afford to deliver them or how we can find income generating ways to finance them so we can continue to deliver those services. That is not just a Dacorum issue, it is a local authority issue. The fight will continue. The good news to end this section of the high is we do have a balanced budget here. We are working on those strategies and they are delivering. And we are delivering in year in terms of our balanced budget as well. So we are going the right way, but the challenge isn't getting easier is the message to take away. Moving on to just to highlight some of our budget and MTFS assumptions. Now, there's no significant change here in terms of what we announced in October in terms of our budget setting perspective. Again, some good financial planning means what we know at the moment coming out of government, these have not changed significantly. If anything, we know now that New Homes Bonus will definitely end in 25-26, and it will be replaced, but by what we don't know. And we still think at this moment in time, the inflation that we've factored into our budgets seems effective and appropriate, and we have a suitable inflation reserve to cover any shortfalls that may be required. Again, we still believe we'll be able to get business rates retention growth for 5-6. Given the reset, that will definitely be a one-off, but that's what we have in our financial plan. And then again, the assumption on council tax, given the government hasn't changed the thresholds, means there's been no other discussion or debate around that at this point in time. Where has that left us? That left us with a budget gap of 590,000, circa 600, which started at the beginning of this financial year. In terms of delivering that, that's primarily been delivered in 25-26 or entirety by income generation linked to garages, a small amount of car parking income growth, over and above what was already factored in for this year on previous estimates, and some of the other income that's been achieved over and above what the inflationary increases we projected. In terms of risks, they don't change. Government funding, we've talked enough about that. It's a low risk for 25-26. Medium term, it's a higher risk, but we'll find out more from government in terms of where we go on that. The reason we've got delivery of additional income generation is when you're increasing fees and you're driving that agenda, there's always potentially a response from users. We have to react to that and be agile to make sure that we can manage that risk if there are any risks that occur. And as always, managing our budgets, making sure we've got control of all our expenditure budgets. Some of our key strategies, be it the commercial income review, looking at the expenditure in all our commercial services, or the housing transformation review, looking at how we deliver that service and how we can deliver it as efficiently as possible. And then again, a strategic asset review, looking at how we operate our assets. They are all challenging how much we spend on those service areas, on our assets, and how we can do that better. But there will always be a risk because those services, particularly services like waste and frontline, are coming under more and more pressure year on year. Again, a little bit more detail there in terms of the budget pressures, income generation. There is going to be a little presentation on commercial property and finance and resources, just to pick up some of the lines that are in the budget report. The waste service will always be under pressure. We're building more homes. That means we've got more work to do. There's significant increases in policy change as well. The extended producer responsibility bill will be coming in for 25-26, which will mean that we will have to look at how we can generate income to fund an additional service to pick up more recyclable waste from different locations and to also dispose of it in different ways. So again, something that the service will have to react to, and we're already planning that in the short and the medium term. Service demand, the one area I would highlight is temporary accommodation. We have managed temporary accommodation in this organisation phenomenally well over recent years. The numbers have been very low. There has been a nationwide increase in temporary accommodation, with some core budgets of some councils being 30-40% taken up by temporary accommodation. We do have a pressure on our current budgets of 300,000, but we are working in terms of how we can look at that in the medium and longer term. But it will be an ongoing pressure as there are wider economic impacts and also wider issues around the Home Office and the decisions that they make around some of the asylum resettlements. So moving on to 25-26 and growth, investments, inflation. Not a lot in the budget for 25-26. Very standard approach. In terms of growth, the growth has been at an absolute minimum because, as we were saying earlier, there is a gap between expenditure and income. We just couldn't afford to offer growth. So we've had to find unique and different ways to continue the service delivery that we're doing. The employee pay award at 3.5% seems fair and robust at this point in time. And equally, the inflation we've got around supplies and services, fuel and utilities is again in line with our current expectations. In line with the expectations we outlined at the MTFS. And again, in terms of income generation, we've had discussions around many of those before, but again, that is showing how we're looking to balance our budget overall year on year. Council tax and business rates don't necessarily have a huge direct impact on Dacorum. They can if our collection rates go down or our growth doesn't go up. But what it does have is a huge impact on our residents and our businesses. And often from speaking to members, these are the areas which fill your inbox in terms of queries and questions. And I know the ones that I get referred to are more around these areas. In terms of business rates, we had the first revaluation in 2023, and next year is the final year of the transitional relief. Now, for some members who've been here a few years, remember that when business rates were revalued, they jumped significantly. And in Dacorum, it was by almost 30% on average. What the government did is they provide a step grant over 3 years. So it was a phased increase, which was great, but it does mean that businesses see an increased cost year on year over 3 years. And as we all know, as that goes to that period, that begins to bite a little harder. So from our perspective, it is making collecting harder. We are achieving our target, but it is becoming more and more difficult to do so, and the queries and questions are becoming more and more impactful in terms of the businesses as a whole. That will end next year, and we will have a complete reset for 26/7. So businesses will be knocking on your door, and I'll use the word again, uncertain about what their future bills will be or where they will go. But hopefully we will keep members and businesses informed as the government takes us on that journey. In terms of, from our own perspective, we will be returning circa 0.5 million more business rates in 25/6, which is off the back of being part of a Hertfordshire pool in 24/5, which allows us to retain more of the growth that we achieve. It's a very technical system in terms of who's in the pool and who isn't. We were in last year, we're out next year. We were in 3 years ago. I could spend hours trying to explain that. It's genuinely a minefield worth staying away from. Equally as we don't know if that will exist in 26/7 onwards either. So from that perspective, it's one probably left for a future year discussion. In terms of council tax, always put this up. It's one of the things that I think members struggle with residents on the doorstep, making or getting residents to understand how little of that potentially big bill, circa 2,200 for a Band D equivalent, comes to Dacorum. I'll reiterate it, it's a line I use every year. Even with our 2.99% increase, £5–6 a week to a resident gets their bin picked up, gets their green spaces looked after, gets homelessness looked after, gets all those services that we do as a council. And the reason we can do it for that amount of money, when you can't get anybody to pick up your waste every week for £6, is because, again, some of our income generation and some of our surpluses that help us support those core statutory services. So again, that wider strategy plays through in keeping council tax as low as we can. Government expects us to increase council tax by 2.99%. When they do the fair funding review next year, they will look at the need of a council, the services you look at, what's the need, what's the deprivation, what's the demand, and then they'll look at your resources. How much income can you achieve? They will assume every council has increased council tax by the maximum amount. If you haven't, historically, or this year, you will end up with a budget deficit in the new budgets going forward. So again, we have followed the government mantra and done what they expect us to do. And along with the vast majority of the sector, some 98.5% of the sector last year. So a significant avenue. There is one slight change to government policy and council tax this year. They have said if specific authorities on a case-by-case basis are having significant financial issues, they can get in touch with MHCLG around looking at overruling that 2.99% interest. I imagine that would be a difficult process and would be a process for a council that would be in a far worse financial position than ourselves at the moment. So from that perspective, I don't think that is a case for ourselves, but it is something that other authorities in more financial constraints may be looking at. Moving on to the HRA, this doesn't involve council tax, it doesn't involve our general fund budget as a whole, because the HRA is a self-financing budget. I'm just going to give a very high level because I do not want to steal Darren's thunder and his team, who've got a presentation later with a lot more detail. But just as a synopsis, particularly for newer members, the HRA is a separate budget from the general fund. The HRA is entirely funded through the revenue we get from rent. It's ring-fenced, it's got a concrete wall around it. That money has to be spent on the homes that we're providing for those tenants. The general fund is funded through government grants, council tax, and income generation, as we've said. They are completely separate. There are some things that general fund staff do in the HRA and it's recharged, but it is effectively set completely separately as two different companies. Much easier funding, as you can see, it's all around dwelling rents or what we're charging to tenants on the whole, be it tenant charges or leaseholder charges. So it is self-financing, the rent comes in, it pays for the service delivery. Apologies, I've just noticed that says 23, 24 at the top, it should say 25, 26. In terms of housing revenue account for next year, the pay award inflation is set the same as the general fund. Normally follows suit, it's the same terms and conditions and the same pay scales. And in terms of rent, again, we followed the government stipulated CPI plus 1%. I can tell you now, there are a lot of HRAs out there that would like to see that increase significantly more, who are under significant pressure because of lots of new burden pressures and lots of new policy that's coming in the housing area. There is some serious concerns across the sector around the future sustainability of HRAs going forward. But again, we are looking to utilise the CPI plus 1% to keep the HRA sustainable. We cover off our interest payable. We've got some £360 million plus of debt linked to the HRA. That seems like a lot of money. The portfolio is worth over £1 billion. So from that perspective, we're not in any negative equity or anywhere near that situation. We've invested well in terms of our HRA portfolio and will continue to do so. Again, just some high-level views in terms of pressures going on. £1 million each year additional almost on maintenance, and that will carry on year. And in the 30-year business plan, some of you will see later, you'll see that that's a significant contribution. And again, we are now looking at putting some money into reserves in the HRA to support the risks and to support future financial resilience, because they've been drawing down reserves in the last couple of years and needs to be in a position to top them up to ensure that from a risk perspective, it is a sound business plan going forward. Closing summary, protecting frontline services still remains in place. There are no redundancies planned in 25-26. There is a slight change this year though. From 26-27 onwards, that's no longer a given. We will be looking at our services, how we deliver them, who delivers them, and looking at different ways of approaching them. The potential for redundancies in future years is higher than it has been previously, given the pressures that we have in our medium-term financial strategy. Almost £1 million at the moment in 26-27, 2 million over the next 3 years. That's a significant amount. And from an income generation perspective, we've driven that a lot over the last few years. The likelihood is efficiencies will be required as part of that wider picture as well. A couple of strategies around asset strategy and around commercial opportunities will hopefully drive some of that agenda as well. We will continue to use reserves appropriately as and when to drive key strategic objectives, and the control of reserves as always is still under member control. So there's no changes there in terms of how they are used. As always, it's critically important that we continue to monitor government updates, be it the December settlement, be it the spring fair funding review, and also other areas in terms of funding settlements going forward. And trying to maximise what we can utilise from government or new policies and new grants that may come about. That is it for my introductory presentation. I'm happy to take general headline questions on what I've presented here in this forum, but any specific questions is best targeted in the different scrutiny group after this, given we've got the relevant officers, as you can see, many around the room here who can give you far better answers than myself on specific details.
Okay, I seem to have one, but it's coming up as just councillors. I'm trying to spot the Adeleke, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for your presentation. Based on what you've presented, you've been able to cushion the blow from government reduced funding through your radical program of income generation. Okay, is this largely based on asset disposal? That's the first question. And my second question is, what happens when you run out of disposable assets?
So disposing of assets isn't part of our income generation, quite the opposite to a certain extent. A lot of our income generation is about maximising the use of our assets, be that car parks, be that other services that we provide. The income generation has been around a lot of the fees and charges, and the commercial income review that's been undertaken to drive some of the income from services, discretionary services that we deliver to residents. At the moment, there is no real capital receipts plan going forward. We want to use the assets we've got more effectively. There may be in the future capital receipts coming in, but most of that will likely be reinvested back into other capital assets.
Thanks, Nigel. Councillor Symington.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. I wanted to ask about the employer's NI that you've detailed in the report. I think that you've highlighted 600,000. Is that all the suppliers' employer's NI? I also couldn't see any reference to the minimum wage and the impact of that, which has obviously gone up quite a lot more than your employee pay award. So is your employee pay award an average across all the services? I mean, across all the staff, which I'm sure it is. But what is the impact of the minimum wage increase on the council?
So I would love the 600,000 to be all supplies and services. That's the 600,000 is our core employee costs. So that is our staff, and that is a combination of the 1.2% increase in NI, but also the reduction of the threshold at which you start paying NI. It's split almost identical, 300,000 on each. Supplies and services, we are working with our contractors and hoping that that can come in within the 3.1% we've allowed in the budget. But again, that's something we'll be constantly reviewing. Some contracts will be allowing for it, some won't. So there's a lot of work still ongoing in that area. In terms of your second question, the minimum wage increases were significant, but from our perspective as a council, our minimum paid staff were still above the new minimum wage. So that does not have an impact on our pay scales. The 3.5% is an average of what we expect to see across the whole workforce, because likelihood in recent years, there's been a cash amount that's been paid, which means the lowest paid staff are seeing increases up to 10% a couple of years ago, I think 6% this year, and the highest paid staff are seeing 2 or 3%. So it is an average overall.
Okay, thanks. Can I just come back? So thank you for that. I think that's what I've understood before, that you don't have, council does not have a lot of staff on the minimum wage, which is good. But in terms of the grants that you're making you're contracting out other services, there are charities and people you're commissioning from who are impacted by these figures. Are they coming back and asking for larger grants from DBC, or are DBC just going to be contracting less from them?
So it's a bit of a mixture. Some contracts will stay. If there's changes to NI or other things, then the cost of the contract will increase. And the contractual increases that we've been looking at and reviewing. Some contracts don't necessarily have that included, and that's when we're engaging with our providers in terms of what they can do. There are other services out there where they can look to reclaim income to recoup that cost, which means it does push up the cost of services. One of those that comes to mind is our leisure service, for instance. They need to recoup the cost, the increased cost of delivering that service. And so you'll see slightly higher increase in the fees for those services than you would expect. Not just a decorum issue, it's an economic issue, unfortunately, which is why at the moment there are projections saying that inflation will start to increase slightly in the short and medium term, higher than what was expected 2 or 3 months ago. And again, that will come back round to bite us if inflation's higher next year, and we'll have more savings to find. So yeah, we are engaging. We are very much a listening organisation when it comes to those entities, particularly some of the charities and the voluntary sectors, and we work more in partnership. So I'm hoping we can find the right solutions. There is a little over £300,000 in the budget for inflation on supplies and services. So there is scope there with some of those contracts.
Thanks, Nigel. Councillor England.
Thank you, Nigel. Nigel, are we seeing any benefit from energy efficiency in this budget?
So we have been able to reduce our utility budgets by, I think it's 60,000 initially next year, because in the last 12 months we have used less and we've paid less for the energy that we have used. So yes, we are starting to see inroads. Directly linking it to our green agenda, is very difficult because there are lots of variables at play. But the message and the strategy across the organisation is very clear on trying to use less energy and trying to use energy that is green or costing less as a result of that. So from that perspective, there is a very strong correlation between the green agenda and the reduced in cost in utilities.
Thanks again. Councillor Silwell.
All right. Annual rent is increased by 2.7, but it can be, potential is 11.1 to where we are, where our plan is to increase rents.
That might be a better...
it might be a better question later for the housing and community group.
Somebody will ask this. Okay.
Thanks. Councillor Duris.
Thank you. Looking at the figures, the police element of the council tax is higher than our element of the council tax. Given that we've got a new PCC, have you got any advanced intelligence of what the thinking might be in terms of the police element of the council tax?
So just for the wider group, the PCC has more freedoms on how to increase their precept. We were higher than the PCC until about 2 years ago, but they've been doing fairly standard £10 annual increases in recent years. I am meeting with the CFO of the PCC tomorrow, so I will probably find out informally what they will do. I have no insider knowledge, but I think it'll probably be around £10 increase.
Thank you. Councillor Patterson.
Thank you for your presentation. It's one relatively small point. Can you confirm that there was no danger of town and parish councils losing the grants they get from Decorum to carry out kind of neighbourhood duties that we do on behalf of Decorum, like having a town warden and so on? Thank you.
I can confirm that for 25-26, the grants to the warden and the concurrent services grants to parish and town councils will be frozen. We have been reviewing that and we have been working closely with parish councils, and that work will continue for future years to assess what services are being delivered, how they're being delivered, and the most effective and efficient way of delivering those services, which may be with town and parish councils. That work needs to start off in January in earnest in terms of finding that medium-term solution. It's all about providing value for money for the taxpayer. And if we can work with town and parish council to deliver those services in the most economical way and funded in the best way, then that's ideally what the council wants to do. Hence, we've made no changes for 25-26 after that liaison with town and parish councils, but we will carry on those conversations next year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So just one quick one from me, and then I think we're done. You've mentioned about the situation with government grants. Do we have any indication that the process for councils getting access to government funding will continue to put the burden onto council staff to apply for individual grants, or is there any expectation that that will change?
So the government narrative is very clear. They want fewer, more standardised grants that do not go through bidding processes. Whether that means they're allocated through an apportionment method that a local authorities don't necessarily agree with is a story for another day. But the headline is that there'll be less bidding grants, more standardised grants, less of them. From our perspective, we are getting, outside of business rates, 2 grants in 25-26, new homes bonus, and potentially, we believe, minimum funding guarantee. And both of those will not end, will not exist after 25-26. So that's, to use my favourite word, that is uncertainty, like we've never had before. This is the most one-off budget I've ever set in 15 years, because all our funding streams, business rates, MFG, new homes bonus, are all getting ripped up for 26-27. So it's exciting, but it's uncertain.
Thanks. I do have a follow-up, but I'll save it for the F&R meeting. So just in case anybody else wants to come in, Councillor Duris.
No, I'll just make a very brief point about the concurrent services grant. And I appreciate what you said, Nigel. I think it may be that there are some parishes that are tuned into this meeting this evening and they may be hearing it. I think it's important to just make them aware that if they're getting, let's say, £7,000 for the warden grant, that they actually spend that money on the wardens, and they don't think, we can get a better deal by only spending £3,500 and we'll spend the other £3,500 on something else. So if you like, there's a salutary lesson for town and parish councils to bear that in mind. And I hope you might agree with my summation on that.
I do. I'm hoping that town and parish councils received an official email last week giving them all these. I'm seeing nods. Thank you. I was starting to get concerned. But you went out in my name. So from that perspective, we will be working much closer with them in terms of, what they deliver and how they deliver it and how they maximise the use of those funds.
Okay, thanks very much. And we're all very much used to Zoom, so now it's a breakout session.